June 22, 1941. For 30 hours, along the mist-choked forests of Belarus, the air smells faintly of pine resin, soil, and the acrid tang of diesel exhaust. You hear it first. The rumble of thousands of tracks and wheels, a mechanical heartbeat stretching for miles. The Wehrmacht surges eastward, a tide of gray uniforms and steel. Operation Barbarossa, set in motion with meticulous precision. Infantry columns march along muddy roads, rifles slung over shoulders, bayonets gleaming faintly in the dim dawn light. Motorized units move with controlled urgency. Trucks laden with supplies, artillery pieces glinting under a pale sun that barely pierces the fog. Engineers toil silently, bridging streams and clearing obstacles, aware that every delay can unravel the timetable meticulously calculated in the Reich's war rooms. The Luftwaffe cuts the clouds above in perfect formation. Stuka-dive bombers screech overhead, wings streaking towards Soviet positions, their sirens a shriek of inevitability. Jagdgeschwader fighters provide cover, their Messerschmitt Bf 109s darting like shadows between the early light and smoke trails. On the ground, you see men clutch maps, shouting coordinates, adjusting to the nervous rhythms of war. Radios crackle, officers bark commands, and signals flags flutter as reconnaissance units push ahead to mark positions for the following waves. It is early summer, yet the soil beneath their boots is already sticky, the rains of spring leaving roads treacherous. Tanks churn forward, their treads tearing blackened tracks through the churned earth, engines whining, guns ready to roar at the first hint of resistance. In the villages along the way, the local population vanishes before the advancing units. Windows shuttered, livestock driven off. German soldiers move past with disciplined focus, eyes scanning for partisans. But most find only silence. Smoke from previous skirmishes curls lazily over farmhouses, the faint smell of burning hay mingling with the ever-present scent of diesel and cordite. Artillery batteries set up with astonishing speed, howitzers aimed to support infantry thrusts, the barrels of their guns smudged with grease, the crews already calculating trajectories. Behind them, supply trains rattle over primitive railways, the crews straining against the weight of ammunition and fuel that must last a projected 6-week campaign to Moscow. At dawn, the first contact occur. Scouts report Soviet border posts abandoned or lightly defended. Machine guns crack from hedgerows. Sporadic fire from T-20X and BT tanks meets German armor with uncoordinated resistance. But for every skirmish, every firefight, the German advance remains relentless, driven by belief in blitzkrieg, in speed and in inevitability. You watch a panzer unit surge through a village, the tracks crushing walls and fences alike. Soldiers leap from the tanks, rifles raised, eyes scanning for snipers. Smoke mingles with dust, creating a haze that stains the morning air gray. The sound is deafening, engines gunfire, shouted orders, and the low rumble of distant artillery. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks begin to form. Supply columns lengthen, stretching for tens of miles behind the front lines. Fuel convoys crawl along rutted roads, bridges sag under weight, and the rhythmic certainty of advance starts to fray. Officers exchange worried glances over maps, the distances already surpassing initial calculations. Engineers mark each destroyed railway line, each impassable bridge. The mud is slow, unforgiving, and merciless. A truck sinks to its axles in quagmire, men attempting to push it free, hands blackened with grease, faces etched with strain. The calendar still promises victory by autumn, but the physical reality begins to whisper otherwise. By mid-morning, the first German soldiers glimpse the Russian defenses beyond the forests. Hastily constructed trenches, anti-tank ditches, and scattered bunkers bristling with Soviet artillery. Observers report massed infantry, irregular but determined. The initial euphoria of rapid advance gives way to caution. Reconnaissance planes mark enemy positions, but the ground is already too vast to monitor thoroughly. For every kilometer gained, the Wehrmacht loses hours in coordination, hours in supply, hours in certainty. Communication wires stretch thin. Radios fail intermittently under overload. Officers scribble notes in leather-bound logs, recording fuel consumption, rations, ammunition stocks, all creeping toward dangerous levels if the schedule falters. At the edge of a river, German engineers attempt a pontoon crossing. The water is high from spring runoff, swirling with debris and ice remnants from the late thaw. Soldiers struggle to secure boats and bridging equipment, boots slipping, weapons rattling, the cold cutting through summer uniforms unexpectedly. The river takes hours to bridge. The delay is minor on paper, but the front has already moved faster than support can follow. The scale of the operation magnifies every error. Minutes stretch into hours, hours into a creeping sense of unease. Even as German officers remain confident in reports of rapid territorial gains, the weather begins to whisper of complications ahead. Clouds thicken in the east, faint frost still clinging to low-lying areas. Snow will come early. Roads that held through mud will fail under ice. Fuel will freeze, men will shiver, and the timetable that Hitler celebrated in his Berlin war room will collide with the brutal truth of Russian winter. By afternoon, columns converge near a small Belarusian town. The streets are narrow, winding, and clogged with transport. Supply shortages already begin to surface. Men fight through fatigue, engines overheat, and tension simmers among the ranks. Commanders realize that speed, the very instrument of blitzkrieg, is now a fragile illusion, dependent on roads that cannot bear the weight of ambition. And in Moscow, thousands of kilometers away, the faint outlines of defensive preparation are already underway, unseen by German eyes, but relentless in their patience. The war that seemed on the cusp of early victory had begun its slow, grinding truth. July 3rd, 1941, 6:15 hours, on the outskirts of Smolensk. The morning is thick with fog, clinging to pine and birch as if the forest itself resists invasion. You hear it before you see it. The muted groan of German trucks, strained engines coughing under the weight of men, ammunition, and fuel. Soldiers stumble through rutted dirt roads slick with rain from the night before, boots sucking in clay, faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. Behind the initial euphoria of blitzkrieg, uncertainty begins to creep into the Wehrmacht's advance. The columns stretch longer than intended, each kilometer exposing supply weaknesses that had seemed inconsequential in brief operational simulations. Forward observers note the first troubling signs. Fuel depots are running lower than predicted. Trucks break down under the constant strain, wheels buried in mud that refuses to release its grip. Engineers hastily attempt repairs, using crowbars and makeshift ramps, hands raw, sleeves soaked, eyes narrowing against the glare of an emerging sun. Every halt of a convoy echoes across the stretched command network. Infantry waits, artillery is delayed, and tanks idle while ammunition lags behind. The initial confidence of rapid success is already under siege by the slow arithmetic of logistics. By mid-morning, German units enter small villages stripped of resources. Civilians have fled, leaving houses shuttered and streets eerily silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the scraping of a horse-drawn cart abandoned in haste. Soldiers sweep through, rifles at the ready, scanning hedgerows and farmyards for partisans. In one courtyard, a squad discovers a cache of Soviet rations and a few rifles, abandoned but untouched. Officers note the signs. The enemy avoids confrontation, trading time for space. The Russians understand the terrain and the limits of German endurance, and they exploit it methodically. The first engagements begin in earnest along the Dnieper approaches. Reconnaissance units encounter small pockets of Soviet defenders in hastily dug trenches. Light artillery rattles in reply, sending shrapnel across fields of mud and grass. Panzer units maneuver into position, treads churning, engines straining. Infantry follows, rifles raised, eyes scanning for snipers hidden among trees and in shell craters. The fighting is fragmented, sharp, but does not produce the overwhelming collapse the German staff anticipated. For the first time, officers calculate not just enemy strength, but also the delays imposed by terrain and weather. The first cracks of doubt appear. As the day progresses, communication lines falter. Field telephones stretch along roads now churned to a quagmire, wires torn by passing vehicles or caught in mud. Radio channels, overburdened by messages from multiple fronts, hiss with static. Commanders strain to coordinate advancing panzer divisions with infantry and supply units. Messages must be repeated, often misunderstood, creating tension along the entire chain of command. A breakdown here, even minor, translates to lost hours, and in a campaign that depends on speed, hours are catastrophic. By afternoon, rain returns, fat droplets hammering steel helmets, pooling in shell craters and trenches. Trucks attempting to traverse unpaved roads sink to axles. Infantry slog forward, water seeping into boots, cold setting in even under summer uniforms. Officers note the slow accumulation of fatigue, exhaustion etched into faces of soldiers who had marched hundreds of kilometers with near-constant engagement. Supply units struggle to bring fuel and ammunition to the forward elements, their engines stalled or broken down, mechanics frantically improvising repairs in the mud. The columns of men, vehicles, and artillery stretch into the distance, resembling a long, faltering snake across the pale Belarusian landscape. In a small forest clearing, a German sergeant crouches beside a half-track immobilized by mud, issuing orders through clenched teeth. Nearby, a platoon attempt to lift artillery pieces from deep ruts, sleeves rolled to elbows, fingers bleeding from friction and cold. The slow, grinding work contrasts sharply with the triumphant visions of Blitzkrieg, which had promised swift penetration and decisive victories. It is here, amid the fog, the mud, and the relentless exertion, that the limits of planning collide with reality. Intelligence reports indicate that Soviet reinforcements are closer than expected. Trenches are reinforced, machine gun nests constructed in patterns designed to slow the German advance. Engineers report destroyed rail lines and sabotaged bridges ahead. The weather is turning, and forecasts predict early frosts. Officers exchange grim looks. Maps that once promised conquest now outline obstacles. Commanders realize that each kilometer forward requires exponential effort in logistics, manpower, and coordination. The promise of autumn arrival in Moscow begins to appear impossibly optimistic. By late afternoon, German columns arrive at a shallow river crossing near Smolensk. Water levels are higher than anticipated, the current swift, debris floating like driftwood. Engineers scramble to erect pontoon bridges, soldiers standing knee-deep in freezing water, rifles clattering against wet steel, shouting orders over the roar of the river. Tanks and trucks wait in tense lines. Hours are lost. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable in theory, begins to crawl, slowed by weather, terrain, and the weight of its own ambition. Nightfall brings cold and uncertainty. Soldiers dig shallow trenches in mud, attempting to rest, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes heavy with fatigue. Commanders pore over maps under lantern light, noting delays, fuel consumption, and the increasing distance from supply lines. Each report adds to the creeping realization. Moscow is no longer a destination reachable in weeks. Winter looms, and the plan that Hitler had envisioned, rapid conquest, decisive victory, is under silent, inexorable threat from terrain, climate, and distance. And somewhere beyond the fog, in the depth of Russian forests and across river crossings, Soviet forces watch and wait, trading space for time. Their patience, their discipline, and the vastness of the land begin to weave a snare the German army cannot yet perceive. A campaign that began with thunderous confidence faces its first true test, the unyielding reality of winter, distance, and stretched supply chains. August 10th, 1941, 7:05 hours, near Vyazma. The sun rises pale through a sky streaked with smoke from burning villages and forest edges. You hear the clatter of German half-tracks attempting to traverse a muddy country road, engines churning, treads spinning in thick clay. Dust and smoke combine with the mist to form a gray haze, hanging over the advancing columns like a shroud. Soldiers stumble along, M35 feel backpacks heavy, canteens empty, faces streaked with grime, eyes hollow with fatigue. The army's advance is no longer a sleek, unstoppable machine. It is a grinding organism, struggling to maintain momentum as wheels sink and boots slip. Panzer divisions strain to reach designated positions. Tanks, overburdened with fuel and ammunition, bogged down in fields softened by recent rains. Infantry follow in long, ragged lines, rifles held ready, scanning tree leans for the first signs of Soviet ambushes. Orders are shouted over the roar of engines and wind in the trees. Engineers work furiously, try and pull vehicles free. Chains straining, hands raw from effort. Each minute lost echoes forward, delaying artillery, ammunition, and reinforcements. The calculation of speed, the lifeblood of Blitzkrieg, is slipping through the Wehrmacht's fingers. Supply lines are stretched thin. Railheads that promise efficiency now struggle to maintain throughput. Locomotives crawl along tracks torn apart by retreating Soviets or submerged under swollen rivers. Fuel convoys are delayed, often stranded in mud, engines smoking. Ammunition cannot reach the forward artillery units in time, forcing gun crews to ration shells even as enemy positions appear closer. Forward officers send urgent reports back to Corps headquarters. Every message underscores a single, terrifying reality. The operational tempo cannot be maintained. By mid-morning, the first frost touches exposed skin. Soldiers feel the chill creeping into uniforms, cold amplifying fatigue. Water freezes in canteens overnight. Meals consist of thin broth or hard bread, energy drained from men forced to march, dig, and fight under extreme conditions. The pace of combat leaves little time for rest or maintenance. Uniforms soaked from rain days earlier have dried stiff with mud and grime. Frostbite is a constant threat, gnawing at fingertips and toes, slowing work and sapping morale. The army that once surged forward like a tidal wave now crawls through a land that resists it at every step. Artillery units experience compounding difficulties. Guns become mired in mud, limbers stuck, wheels spinning uselessly. Crews struggle to reposition howitzers to maintain fields of fire. Forward observers risk exposure in shell craters to call coordinates, shouting over wind and distant gunfire. Ammunition is rationed, each round precious, each delay fatal. Even minor logistical failures cascade into operational paralysis. A column waits for a broken truck to be freed, and suddenly an entire battalion is immobilized. The mathematical precision of blitzkrieg falters against a mud that ignores doctrine. Soviet resistance adapts. Snipers emerge from forests, firing from concealed positions in trees or shell craters. Light artillery and mortars harass advancing units, forcing pauses and adjustments. Delays in movement allow the Red Army to reinforce positions, dig new trenches, and organize counterattacks. Each German officer realizes the enemy's tactical patience exceeds expectations. Calculated resistance, skirmishes rather than pitched battles, forces the invader into attritional conditions for which Hitler's planners had not prepared. By afternoon, the columns of vehicles and infantry stretch for miles along the muddy roads. Convoys overlap, half-tracks blocked by stalled trucks, soldiers forced to wait in rank, rifles slung over shoulders. Dust, mud, and smoke mix into a choking slurry. Every sound, engine groan, shouted order, distant rifle crack, is amplified by the eerie stillness of empty fields and abandoned villages. Supply officers scratch their heads over maps, recalculating rations, fuel, and ammunition. Every delay tightens a noose on the Army's momentum. Small engagements punctuate the advance. Infantry encounters concealed bunkers along the Dnieper, machine guns firing from slits carved into earthworks. Mortars lob rounds with terrifying precision, often targeting choke points where German vehicles are forced to pause. Artillery fire arrives sporadically, often late, because ammunition cannot reach the guns in time. Casualties mount incrementally, not in massive, decisive waves, but in a slow, grinding attrition that erodes confidence, stamina, and operational cohesion. Nightfall brings temporary respite and new complications. Soldiers bivouac in forests, foxholes, and shallow trenches. Frost settles into hair, collars, and mittens. Officers gather by lantern light, poring over maps and calculating distances, fuel consumption, and troop readiness. The realization spreads. The projected timetable for reaching Moscow is no longer feasible. Each kilometer forward demands hours of logistical wrangling, and the coming Russian winter looms like a specter over the entire campaign. Above the column, Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots report terrain conditions that defy expectations. Rivers swollen with summer rains, forests dense and obstructive, roads impassable for heavy equipment. Supply problems compound with enemy interference, and intelligence suggests that Soviet forces are falling back in order, leaving minimal contact to slow the Germans strategically, but they are regrouping farther inland. The Wehrmacht moves forward, but at a fraction of the speed predicted. Each day a battle with the elements as much as with men. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in forests and along frozen rivers, Soviet forces prepare to exploit every delay. The army that thundered across Europe now encounters a theater that ignores rapidity, punishes overextension, and transforms success into exhaustion. Commanders grasp at the machine they built. Tanks, infantry, artillery, trucks, fuel lines cannot surmount the land without breaking itself. Momentum is slowing. Winter is coming. And with it, the first true test of strategy, endurance, and survival. September 21st, 1941, 6:45 hours, along the Oka River approaches. A pale sun barely penetrates the dense fog that clings to the forests and fields. You hear the crunch of frost under boots, the metallic scrape of skis dragged by supply units attempting to bypass mud-choked roads. Soldiers breathe clouds of white vapor that freeze in the air before dissipating. Their uniforms are stiff with grime and moisture, hands and faces red with cold. The first signs of winter have arrived, insidious and unrelenting. Vehicles groan as tracks grind through partially frozen mud, wheels locked in icy ruts. Engines cough, smoke curling upward, carrying the stench of fuel and overheated metal. Soldiers shift weight nervously, eyes scanning the tree leans for both ambush and frostbite. The Wehrmacht supply situation deteriorates. Long columns of trucks, carrying rations, fuel, and ammunition, stall in icy quagmires, wheels spinning uselessly, gears grinding. Engineers work frantically with shovels and chains, hammers ringing against steel, trying to free vehicles in temperatures that bite through gloves. The winter mud is heavier than summer clay, sucking machinery down with slow, inexorable force. Each delay sends ripples down the column. Infantry without food, artillery without shells, tanks without fuel. The carefully calibrated blitzkrieg timetable collapses incrementally, invisibly, until it becomes a crushing weight. Infantry marches through frozen fields, boots sinking into hardened ruts and snow-dampened soil. Frost forms on rifles and bayonets, searing exposed skin. Soldiers' faces are etched with exhaustion, eyes hollow, lips blue. Officers bark orders over teeth chattering, using maps that curl at the edges from dampness. Radio communications falter. Static distorts messages, leaving units isolated. Coordination fractures as each battalion struggles to maintain alignment with adjacent formations. The precise choreography that propelled the advance across Poland and Ukraine is now reduced to improvisation, survival, and the slow agony of delay. Soviet resistance grows more deliberate. Snipers and light artillery harass roads, ambush convoys, and target bridges. Each attack is small but cumulative, forcing German units to pause, reposition, and absorb casualties while the weather compounds misery. Frostbitten soldiers dig shallow foxholes, their shovels frozen to the earth. Mortars fire from hidden positions, often striking roads where heavy trucks are bogged down. Machine gun nests erupt from forest edges, targeting German engineers laboring to free immobilized vehicles. Every meter gained is bought at immense cost of human and mechanical endurance. Artillery units suffer acutely. Guns freeze, lubricants congeal, and crews struggle to aim over snow-dusted berms. Ammunition arrives late, often in pieces, forcing rationing of shells while enemy positions remain visible and threatening. Forward observers risk exposure in bitter wind, standing in shallow craters to adjust fire. Communication lines snap under ice and stress. Runners navigate slippery paths to deliver orders. Faces stiff with frost, fingers bleeding from repeated exposure. Each misstep magnifies logistical problems, and each delay compounds fatigue. Commanders realize that the Army's speed, a foundation of blitzkrieg, is no longer achievable. By mid-morning, the temperature drops further. Soldiers' breath freezes on jackets. Smoke from engines condenses into ice crystals. Small rivers, swollen with recent rains, begin to freeze along the edges, creating deceptive hazards for infantry and vehicle columns. Frozen mud is treacherous. Trucks fishtail, half-track skid, and soldiers stumble over icy ruts. Frostbite spreads, slow and merciless, taking fingers and toes and hours. Morale sags under the double threat of enemy fire and winter's creeping grasp. The men who had stormed forward with confidence now trudge through a landscape that punishes initiative. Food and fuel shortages intensify. Rations freeze inside packs. Water bottles ice solid overnight. Soldiers gnaw at biscuits that shatter teeth. Thermoses contain slush instead of warm broth. Tanks haul for lack of diesel. Guns freeze. Each delay compounds risk of counterattack. Commanders send urgent telegrams to Corps headquarters, warning that winter is arriving ahead of schedule. Every kilometer forward requires extraordinary effort. Every hour lost strengthens the resolve of the defenders. Above ground, Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirms that snow patches and frozen rivers disrupt supply lines and choke routes. Soviet forces regroup beyond each obstacle, establishing new defensive lines in anticipation of slow German movement. Retreating units leave behind minor obstructions, destroy bridges, and mines frozen into the earth. Each obstruction is minor but cumulative. They delay columns, force repairs, and exact a toll in both manpower and time. The Wehrmacht advances, but not as an unstoppable wave. It shuffles forward, slow by mud, frost, and exhaustion. Nightfall brings an even harsher reality. Soldiers bivouac in makeshift shelters, foxholes, and tree lines. Frost settles on hair, gloves, and equipment. Fires are small, scarce, and dangerous. Smoke reveals positions to the enemy. Officers huddle over maps, calculating progress, fuel consumption, rations, and casualties. Each day lost brings them closer to the winter they had underestimated. Each delay a threat to the campaign's timetable. The creeping winter has revealed a hard truth. The Army's advance toward Moscow cannot rely solely on speed and shock. Logistics falter, coordination fails, morale diminishes, and the cold, patient landscape of Russia has begun to turn from background to adversary. For the first time, German high command is forced to confront a reality they had ignored in planning. The land itself would be an enemy, as lethal and unyielding as the soldiers across the Oka. October 14, 1941, 8 o'clock hours, outskirts of Vyazma, western Russia. A gray dawn settles over the forested expanse. You hear the creak of tracks through mud, the snap of frost-laden branches under boots, the distant thud of artillery echoing across open fields. Smoke rises from burning supply depots, curling into the low-hanging clouds. Columns of German infantry advance cautiously, their uniforms stiff with cold and grime. Tanks crawl ahead, metal groaning under the strain of mud frozen unevenly by night frost. Engineers shovel, hammer, and chain vehicles free, the sound of metal clashing with ice echoing across the plain. Men shiver, faces etched with fatigue, breaths visible in the frigid air. The dream of blitzkrieg momentum fades, slowly with each mile. The approach to Moscow reveals a full scale of logistical collapse. Roads that were supposed to facilitate rapid armored advance are churned into mud by rain and freezing frost, turning each kilometer into an ordeal. Convoys stall for hours, vehicles spinning uselessly, engines overheating or refusing to start in the cold. Horse-drawn wagons supplement mechanized units, their hooves sinking into thawed ruts, forcing infantry to march behind or alongside with packs and weapons dragging in the mud. Every delay means rations arrive late. Ammunition runs short. Medical supplies are delayed, frostbite spreads, and exhaustion mounts. Commanders realize their timetable is unraveling. The High Command's promise of Moscow before winter now slipping away. Soviet resistance hardens. Sniper fire erupts from wooded ridges, punctuated by mortar bursts aimed at overextended supply lines. Defensive positions are prepared in villages, along rail embankments and atop low hills. The Red Army, retreating strategically from the initial onslaught, has allowed space to slow and fragment German forces, then strike at their most vulnerable points. German engineers spend hours reinforcing or repairing roads only to have them destroyed moments later by shellfire or frost-thickened mudslides. The combination of enemy action and terrain becomes a force multiplier for the defenders. Weather compounds the strain. Freezing nights alternate with wet days, turning roads into icy quagmires. Soldiers' boots fill with water, then freeze. Gloved hands become useless for weapon handling. Infantry shiver through patrols and sentry duty, every muscle aching. Tanks bog down repeatedly, and artillery units struggle to maintain alignment and calibration. Lubricants congeal, barrels freeze, rendering weapons temporarily useless. Radios crackle with static. Messages are misinterpreted or lost entirely. Cohesion falters as units move in fragments, isolated by geography, weather, and Soviet interdiction. Morale begins to strain visibly. Veteran units that stormed through Poland and Ukraine now drag themselves along, faces pale from cold and exhaustion. Fresh conscripts arrive at the front lines, wide-eyed, yet quickly learn the price of operating under such conditions. Officers bark orders over teeth-chattering lips, pacing along frozen roads to rally fragmented squads. Reports of frostbite, minor injuries, and exhaustion arrive hourly, each adding to the sense that the timetable is impossible. Discipline is strained, and fear becomes a quiet companion to every soldier. The high command confronts a harsh reality. Hitler's original plan called for Moscow to fall before winter. Intelligence reports, previously optimistic, now indicate that each day lost increases Soviet capacity to reinforce and entrench. Railways, partially destroyed by retreating Red Army units, slow supply further. Bridges over swollen rivers are fragile. Engineers labor under fire to keep them passable. Forward units run low on ammunition, relying increasingly on captured stockpiles. Every kilometer of advance consumes precious time and men. Soviet partisans and small unit harassment add to the mounting challenges. Roads behind German lines are mined or obstructed. Ambushes pick off stragglers. Officers must balance speed with caution, each decision weighed against potential losses and exposure. Morale ebbs further as soldiers witness comrades immobilized by mud, frost, or enemy fire. Medical units struggle under freezing conditions. Frostbite and trench foot become routine, silently eroding manpower. Even as daylight arrives, progress is measured not in kilometers, but in the slow, punishing survival of each unit. Approaching Moscow, the Germans encounter prepared defensive belts. Villages are fortified, anti-tank ditches dug, machine guns sighted on every hillock. Soviet artillery zeroes on choke points, disrupting movement and inflicting casualties on exhausted columns. Tank units attempt to maneuver around frozen obstacles, only to find their path blocked by deep mud or snow-covered earthworks. Engineers attempt temporary repairs or bridging, but the efforts are piecemeal, slow, and under fire. Every step toward the capital exacts a visible toll in men and material. By mid-afternoon, High Command realizes that the initial operational timetable is unattainable. Messages reach the front lines with orders that cannot be executed due to terrain, weather, and resistance. Hitler's promise of capturing Moscow before winter's full onset fades into an acknowledgement that the offensive is stalling. Supplies are insufficient, morale is waning, and the Red Army is regrouping faster than anticipated. Commanders at all levels know that the campaign is entering a phase for which their forces are ill-prepared, a slow, grinding, attritional struggle against winter and an enemy that has learned from earlier losses. Even as German units stand within sight of the city outskirts, the realization hits. Speed is gone, mobility is compromised, and winter is no longer a background factor. It is an adversary. Trenches and roadblocks force the advance into narrow corridors, where every attack risks high casualties. Soldiers trudge through the gray, frozen landscape, faces etched with fatigue, eyes fixed on distant spires and smoke from Moscow's outer defenses. What should have been a decisive blow now transforms into a desperate struggle to maintain cohesion, supply, and momentum. The gap between strategic ambition and reality widens by the hour. Moscow looms, not as a prize to be seized at will, but as a fortress testing every aspect of German planning, endurance, and adaptability. Each mile toward the city costs more than anticipated. Every delay gives the Soviet a chance to reinforce, prepare, and counterattack. The dream of Blitzkrieg has collided with mud, snow, and logistical collapse, forcing High Command to face the impossibility of their original timeline. And as night falls over the Oka and surrounding forests, the army that once surged with confidence now inches forward, uncertain if they can survive the coming winter or the battle that would define the Eastern Front. November 2nd, 1941, 6:15 hours, northwest of Mozhaisk, western Russia. A biting wind sweeps across frozen fields, carrying the sharp tang of ice and smoke from smoldering villages. Frost clings to every surface. Rifles, helmets, leather straps. You hear the grinding of tracks, the low rumble of engines struggling in the icy ruts, the crunch of infantry boots on hard-packed snow. Men pull their coats tighter, faces pinched, teeth chattering, breath steaming into gray morning air. The German advance toward Moscow has slowed to a crawl, progress measured in yards, not kilometers. Every step is a negotiation with winter itself. The Red Army emerges with renewed ferocity. Freshly mobilized Siberian divisions, acclimated to temperatures far below freezing, strike at overstretched German flanks. Mortar fire erupts from concealed tree lines. Artillery shells whistle overhead, bursting into frozen earth with shattering concussive force. Infantry in white winter camouflage appear from frozen gullies, charging with bayonets, grenades, and relentless determination. Soviet snipers, perched in ruined houses or atop snow-covered embankments, pick off exposed officers and radio operators. The front line fractures under the weight of simultaneous assaults, leaving German units isolated and vulnerable. Logistics continue to collapse. Supply lines, once stretched but functional, now resemble thin threads over a landscape transformed into ice and mud. Horse-drawn wagons freeze solid. Trucks skid uncontrollably, jackknifing in deep snowdrifts. Fuel barrels congeal, lubricants thicken, and engines fail. Engineers dig trenches in frozen soil only to have them collapse under artillery fire or frost-shattered earth. Ammunition is rationed by the cartridge. Infantry scavenge rounds from fallen comrades and abandoned positions. Medical teams are overwhelmed as frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion claim as many victims as enemy fire. Corpsmen wrap bandages in freezing wind, their fingers numb and useless, moving from man to man in a landscape of white and gray. German officers attempt to rally their men. Orders are shouted across snow-laden fields, voices lost in wind and the roar of artillery. Units try to consolidate into defensible positions, digging shallow foxholes, shoring up roads, and establishing communication lines through frozen forests. Yet the frost and enemy action constantly erode these efforts. Snow drifts fill trenches overnight. Artillery blasts collapse temporary shelters, and vehicles immobilized in mud become targets for Soviet gunners. Morale frays visibly. Experienced NCOs mutter under their breath. Fresh conscripts tremble from cold and fear. Hitler's original timetable lies in ruins. The city of Moscow remains miles ahead, tantalizingly close yet unattainable. Reports from the front arrive piecemeal, detailing stalled columns, casualties mounting, and enemy reinforcements arriving faster than anticipated. Each delay allows the Soviets to strengthen defensive belts, prepare anti-tank obstacles, and coordinate counterattacks. Winter, once a backdrop, now dictates the tempo. It slows movement, degrades equipment, and punishes overconfidence. Soldiers learn to fear not only bullets and shells, but frostbite, ice, and exhaustion as invisible adversaries. Soviet command demonstrates adaptability. Units withdrawn earlier for strategic depth reappear in fresh positions, often striking where German reconnaissance has reported weakness. Anti-tank teams dig in along narrow roads. Hidden artillery pounds exposed vehicles. Reconnaissance patrols spot German columns stalled in mud and snow, relay positions via wired lines or couriers, and Soviet engineers prepare improvised offensive works overnight. The pace of counteroffensive operations increases. German officers note the deadly efficiency of the Red Army. Men who retreat strategically in daylight return under cover darkness to disrupt supply, communications, and morale. The impact on German morale is profound. Soldiers awake to frost-coated fields, ice-stiffened weapons, and the constant threat of ambush. Food and fuel shortages grow acute. Half-frozen rations barely sustain men. Frostbite claims fingers and toes, and exposure kills quietly alongside combat. Veteran units who once advanced with certainty now trudge forward in a slow, punishing rhythm, eyes fixed on distant smoke plumes indicating Soviet activity. Engineers risk lives on frozen rivers to erect temporary bridges, often under artillery fire that collapses the fragile structures. Each crossing is measured in hours, often minutes, of progress before retreat or repair. Commanders attempt to adapt. Panzer units coordinate closely with infantry, advancing in smaller, more manageable groups. Flanking maneuvers are attempted, though limited by frozen terrain, deep snow, and narrow roads. Supply convoys operate under armed escort, yet breakdowns remain constant. Communications falter. Radios fail in the cold, telegraph wires snap under frost, and runners are lost or delayed. Every tactical adjustment is slow, and every misstep is magnified by winter and enemy action. By mid-November, the first Soviet counteroffensives materialize, striking along the flanks of overstretched German units. They exploit weakened positions. Infantry pushes through frozen fields, using coordinated small arms and artillery fire. Tanks emerge from hidden depressions, targeting immobilized vehicles. Engineers attempt to repair damage, but each effort is undermined by frost and relentless assault. The German advance stalls completely. Units dug in along roads or ridges become static, surviving only through defensive coordination, yet unable to regain momentum. Even as individual acts of bravery occur, officers rallying squads, tanks breaking through snowdrifts, infantry holding machine gun nests. The overall picture is grim. The Red Army's resilience, combined with winter's unrelenting grip, makes every meter toward Moscow a struggle measured in human endurance, supply limitations, and strategic improvisation. Commanders must confront the reality that the original plan, predicated on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force, cannot succeed under these conditions. By late November, German High Command acknowledges the truth. Operation Barbarossa is at a standstill. Moscow, once within reach, remains beyond their grasp. Supplies are insufficient, men are exhausted, and Soviet resistance has hardened into a lethal rhythm of counterattacks. Winter has become a decisive participant, freezing engines, crippling roads, and breaking morale. The blitzkrieg illusion is shattered. A prolonged, attritional struggle is inevitable. The Eastern Front has entered a new phase, one defined by cold, mud, and the relentless pressure of a determined enemy. December 5, 1941, 7:30 hours, outskirts of Moscow, western Russia. A gray dawn stretches across frozen plains, frost glinting on the jagged edges of shattered buildings and abandoned vehicles. The wind carries the acrid scent of diesel and burning wood, mingling with the faint copper tang of blood frozen along icy ruts. Snow crunches under booted feet as German infantry, faces pale from cold and exhaustion, scramble into shallow foxholes behind hastily erected barricades. Tanks, their tracks choked with ice, grind slowly forward, engines coughing steam that condenses into the frigid air. The city itself is just beyond sight, smoke and haze masking spires and domes, but the sound of artillery and rifle fire carries clearly over flat, snowbound landscape. The German advance has stalled entirely. Supplies are critically low. Frozen rations congeal fuel and ammunition rationed by the cartridge. Field hospitals overflow. Corpsmen working with numb fingers, tending frostbite and shrapnel injuries with equal urgency. Frostbite claims soldiers silently, stealing toes, fingers, and sometimes entire limbs. Men collapse mid-march, unable to continue, their breath rising in ragged clouds. Officers bark orders, voices hoarse and often drown in artillery thunder. But the rhythm of the blitzkrieg has vanished. Momentum has become a casualty of ice and snow. Soviet forces occupy positions that were previously thinly held or abandoned. Trenches carved into frozen earth, machine gun nests camouflaged by snow, and anti-tank ditches filled with ice make the German advance a dangerous maze. Snipers pick off officers, artillery coordinates fire with near-perfect precision, and Soviet engineers repair roads and rails even as German units attempt to push forward. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, struggles in harsh conditions. Engines fail on icy runways, and pilots contend with wide-out snowstorms that ground sorties or send aircraft crashing. Morale is shattered. Veteran units who stormed through Ukraine and Belarus now trudge through snow, watching comrades succumb to cold, starvation, or sudden artillery bursts. New conscripts arrive daily, untested and terrified, immediately thrown into frost-laden firing lines. Even elite divisions, like the Panzer Grenadiers and motorized infantry, find themselves immobilized, bogged down in mud churned by thawing snow or frozen rivers that crack under weight. Every maneuver requires careful calculation. Missteps invite annihilation. Hitler's personal directive, issued weeks earlier, demanded a rapid capture of Moscow before the winter deepened. That timetable is impossible. Reports from field marshals arrive fragmented. Columns stall for days, bridges destroyed by retreating Red Army engineers, vehicles abandoned in impassable snow, morale plummeting. Supply lines extend hundreds of kilometers across devastated terrain. constantly under harassment from Soviet partisans and forward units. Frozen rivers and broken roads create choke points, where even a single artillery salvo can immobilize an entire regiment. Soviet counterattacks grow more organized. Siberian divisions, acclimated to temperatures far below freezing, emerge from hidden forests and flanking positions. Infantry armed with Mosin-Nagant rifles, machine guns, and Molotov cocktails strike exposed German units. Tanks concealed in snow-filled depressions target immobilized vehicles, while artillery from Moscow's outskirts pound supply convoys. Engineers attempt to repair roads under fire. Every crossing is perilous, every bridge a potential death trap. Communications are unreliable. Radios fail in the cold, field phones freeze, and runners struggle through deep snow and enemy fire. Individual acts of heroism are common. Lieutenants rally squads frozen in foxholes, directing fire and repositioning artillery to blunt Soviet attacks. Tank crews, fingers blue and numb, push vehicles out of ruts to engage in desperate duels with T-34s hidden behind frozen ridges. Medics crawl across open terrain to reach wounded, cover them with blankets, and administer morphine before freezing fingers and hands can no longer function. Yet these acts cannot alter the broader reality. German forces are mobilized, understrength, and increasingly encircled by a determined enemy. The city itself, though still largely intact, exerts a psychological toll. Smoke rises from factories and destroyed villages outside Moscow, while Red Army signals and shellfire serve as constant reminders of enemy presence. Observation posts report that every kilometer gained costs dozens of casualties. Snow conceals booby traps, anti-tank obstacles, and hidden artillery, ensuring that even successful advances require enormous effort and sacrifice. German units dig in wherever possible, but the winter landscape resists, filling trenches with snow and icing over roads, turning every supply route into a gamble with death. By mid-December, German High Command formally recognized as a failure. Moscow is not merely distant. It is untouchable under current conditions. Units are fragmented, morale is plummeting, and frostbite and starvation have become as lethal as Soviet fire. Hitler's calculations, predicated on speed and overwhelming force, have failed against an enemy resilient, adaptive, and intimately familiar with the environment. Any further attempts at direct assault risk complete encirclement, destruction of entire divisions, and catastrophic losses. The Red Army begins a broader winter offensive. Freshly reinforced units push against flanks and rear echelons, exploiting the frozen, immobilized columns. Artillery targets supply convoys. Infantry attacks isolated regiments. Panzer units, already hampered by ice and mud, cannot respond effectively. Communications break down entirely in some sectors, leaving officers to make life-and-death decisions with partial intelligence. German soldiers cling to foxholes, rationing ammunition, tending frostbitten comrades, and awaiting relief that may never arrive. By December 15th, the German forces outside Moscow are in full retreat. What was meant to be a decisive strike has become a grueling, attritional withdrawal under fire, frost, and fatigue. The winter of 1941 has claimed far more men and material than any single battle. Entire divisions are effectively neutralized as fighting units. Moscow stands, largely untouched, as a symbol of failed strategy, logistical hubris, and the deadly consequence of underestimating both climate and opponent. Operation Barbarossa, once hailed as unstoppable, is halted. The Eastern Front has entered a new, brutal phase where the Germans must fight not only an enemy, but a relentless winter. December 20th, 1941, 6:45 hours, Western approaches to Moscow, Russia. A pale light creeps over frozen plains, glinting on snow-laden trees and the remnants of abandoned vehicles. German troops, battered, hungry, and frostbitten, trudge along ice-slick roads where carts and trucks lie shattered, their engines seized by sub-zero temperatures. Smoke from burned-out supply depots hangs in the air, stinging eyes and throat. The ground crunches beneath boots hardened by weeks of exposure, each step a reminder of the immense toll exacted by both combat and climate. The once confident columns are a patchwork of remnants, soldiers carrying rifles heavier than their frozen limbs, dragging comrades who can no longer march. Behind the front, field commanders huddle in frost-lined tents, maps spread across ice-crusted tables. Reports arrive slowly. Artillery positions overrun. Supply lines severed by partisan attacks. Fuel and ammunition depleted, morale crumbling. Radio sets sputter and fail. Runners stagger through snowdrifts to deliver fragmented intelligence. The reality of the Eastern Front's winter becomes undeniable. High Command, once convinced of a rapid victory, confronts the catastrophic consequences of overextension. The operational timetable was not merely delayed. It is impossible under these conditions. The Soviets, meanwhile, display a grim, calculated patience. Infantrymen move along forested flanks, boots sinking into deep snow, rifles raised, eyes scanning for every shadow. 34 tanks, their armor thick with ice and snow, emerge from hidden depressions to strike at immobilized German vehicles. Artillery, pre-sighted and coordinated, pounds roads and bridges, reducing what little mobility remains. Supply convoys vanish beneath shells and frost, leaving entire battalions stranded without rations or ammunition. The Red Army's understanding of terrain and weather magnifies their advantage, turning the vast expanse of Russia itself into a weapon. German officers issue orders in the cold, their voices hoarse from shouting over artillery and wind. Units are instructed to regroup, conserve fuel, and dig in, but the winter resists every effort. Trenches fill with snow, roads freeze into impassable ruts, and rivers, deceptively solid, fracture beneath the weight of men and vehicles. The logistical nightmare unfolds in real time. Every kilometer gained requires double the effort. Every casualty drains the fragile cohesion of fighting formations, and every frozen supply depot represents a lost lifeline. Soldiers, exhausted and disoriented, press forward with a grim determination born of discipline rather than hope. Supply failures compound human suffering. Food, once considered adequate for extended campaigns, is frozen solid. Canned goods burst when thawed improperly. Water sources freeze, forcing troops to melt snow over makeshift fires. Frostbite claims hands, feet, and faces. Hypothermia lurks with each pause in movement. Medical personnel work tirelessly, but resources are insufficient, and the line between survival and death becomes indistinct. Men share what little warmth they can, huddling together in foxholes or behind wrecked vehicles, whispering prayers or silent curses to stave off despair. Psychological strain mirrors physical attrition. Soldiers recount fleeting memories of home, letters unread, and promises unkept. The fear of encirclement, combined with the relentless cold and constant threat of Soviet counterattacks, gnaws at every mind. Veterans who survived Poland, France, and the Balkans now confront an enemy they cannot simply outmaneuver. The war is no longer defined solely by tactics or firepower, but by endurance, resourcefulness, and the capacity to survive a landscape that actively seeks to destroy them. Soviet strategy evolves alongside the environment. Patrols probe German positions at night, exploiting frozen rivers and forested terrain to infiltrate and ambush. Engineering units construct makeshift bridges and repair railways, ensuring supply lines to frontline divisions remain operational. Infantry and armor operate in tandem, coordinating artillery fire with infantry maneuvers to maximize casualties. Commanders in Moscow issue orders that balance aggression with conservation, understanding that time and climate are allies in attrition. The German invaders are now vulnerable not merely to bullets, but to the very land they sought to conquer. High Command receives grim evaluations from generals in the field. Operation Barbarossa has failed to secure strategic objectives. Moscow remains untaken. Casualties mount, with frostbite and disease now rivaling combat deaths. Panzer divisions immobilized, motorized infantry decimated, and air support limited by frozen runways create a perfect storm of logistical collapse. The dream of a swift campaign evaporates. What remains is a slow, punishing stalemate that will bleed men and material over months. Analysts and planners realize that German doctrine, blitzkrieg dependent on speed, coordination, and fuel, cannot function in conditions it was never designed for. Amid the suffering, individual acts of perseverance stand out. Sergeants organize supply redistribution, ensuring ammunition reaches units still capable of fighting. Medics risk traversing open fields under artillery fire to reach frostbitten and wounded soldiers. Soldiers improvise fuel heaters, repair vehicles with scavenged parts, and dig trenches deep enough to provide some relief from the wind. Discipline and determination prevent total collapse, but they cannot reverse the strategic reality. The winter has halted the invaders, turning their advance into a frozen graveyard. By late December, German forces withdraw incrementally, reorganizing for defense rather than attack. Moscow remains secure. The failure of Barbarossa outside the city marks a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. Hitler's forces have been humbled not solely by Soviet arms, but by terrain, weather, and logistical miscalculation. The lesson is clear. Even the most disciplined army cannot ignore environmental constraints, supply lines, and adaptive opponents. The Eastern Front has demonstrated the lethal combination of winter and overreach, setting the stage for a drawn-out conflict that will test every command decision, every soldier's endurance, and every strategic assumption. In the aftermath, Moscow stands defiant, its citizens and defenders having witnessed the closest brush with disaster yet survived. German soldiers retreat through snow-choked forests, haunted by the immensity of what they underestimated. The Russian winter, the Red Army's resilience, and the unforgiving arithmetic of logistics. The campaign's failure will reverberate throughout military planning, forcing a recognition that no blitzkrieg can conquer an empire under ice, snow, and relentless resistance. Winter has claimed its victory. The Eastern Front has reshaped the war. And for the German High Command, the illusion of unstoppable momentum lies shattered on frozen plains.